Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining NASCA's virtual Thought Leadership Series for 2020. We are so excited to have you with us. Today's session is focusing on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Many of us are drawn to public service because of the opportunity to make a real difference, to impact our communities and our states. And right now, we all have a unique opportunity to significantly impact equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. Many of us on this call oversee state personnel, and we could set our states on paths so that our workforces look like the communities we serve. Many of us oversee procurement, and we can ensure that the billions of dollars that we spend every year are fairly spread across all historically underutilized businesses. And each and every one of us oversees a team, and we can ensure that our agencies and customers see themselves reflected in our teams, and especially in our leadership teams. We hope that this time together allows us to understand how we can make equity, diversity, and inclusion not just an action item or something we're doing just in this moment, but something that we embed in everything that we do so that we can make a real difference in state government. I am delighted to introduce Ace Kawa with us today. Ace is a consultant at Evolve Productions and the managing partner of Equal Sons, a product and strategy agency. As a founder, consultant, and educator, Ace is often asked to help groups think more creatively. In shifting today's work landscape, his focus is typically on ideation, crafting narrative, and maximizing the greatest asset a company has, its people. So you can see he's a perfect speaker for this topic. His former roles include entrepreneur in residence at the VCU School of Business, consultant and facilitator at TMI Consulting, and a member of the Virginia Governor's Council for Youth Entrepreneurship. Ace.
Thank you so much, Cara. I'm thrilled to be here. This is an interesting time, to say the least. I think I was going through a couple titles as I was chatting with my internal team here, and the folks that I've lived in the DEI world with. And as we were considering titles, one of which was America's Current Dumpster Fire, which didn't seem fair, nor did it seem particularly productive, but that's how it feels, I think, right now, as we're trying to figure out how to best navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the conversation therein. So for me, I settled on this as a title: You Can't Unsee It, right? We're amidst quite a bit, and I'll touch on all of that here pretty shortly, but the reality is we're seeing a lot happening in our country today. We've been in a really interesting place over the last 5, maybe 10 years, and there have been several movements that are pushing toward more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive environments for all of us as folks who live in this country and across the world to exist in. And so You Can't Unsee It is really how I've framed a lot of these conversations. And Cara, in the intro, mentioned that I'm a founder. So I've started a couple companies. Some have been small consulting firms, and we've built some high growth, scalable pieces of technology that have forced us into helping navigate policy and finance and a lot of the areas where we see inequity so often. I'm also an educator, and so I teach innovation and entrepreneurship and have hard, uncomfortable conversations, not only in that education realm with entrepreneurship, but with diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. But at the core, the crux of my work, I've found that I'm a mediator, right? It's the ability to navigate uncomfortable conversations, to make some things that are hard to hear a little more palatable. And really, as I define mediation, it's finding common ground to make a decision. Perhaps we could frame it as finding common ground to do the right thing. And over the next 17 or so minutes, that's what we'll talk about today, is getting some common ground. And as I see my role, it's mediating a conversation between those of us in power, I think by virtue of being in this conversation, there is a privilege, there is a power, and we ought to acknowledge that. And the other party perhaps at the table is those folks who don't have a voice in this venue and often don't have a voice as we do our work in building our state governments and operationalizing policy and ultimately getting into a realm where everybody feels comfortable and has a say or a seat at the table. So we'll spend the next couple minutes just getting a baseline for common language, which as we were prepping for this conversation, a bit of what was shared, and I got some incredible insights from the folks that you all will hear from as panelists here in a few minutes. But I got some incredible insights, and one of the pieces was, while we talk about being Americans, which is great, we also have 50 states, and each state has its own focus on DEI, its own acronym for how we discuss DEI, and ultimately is working at its own pace. And so what I'd like to do is suggest that there is some common language for how we navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I want to start here is the framework, because this is, I'd say, maybe the thing that we agree across the board with, irrespective of our state. We have these inalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Someone somewhere said that Thomas Jefferson perhaps drafted that in the first go round, and then the Committee of Five cleaned it up a little bit. And so the thing we see here is mostly the language after that first edit, irrespective of who said it. This is a social contract that we believe here in our country. The life and liberty piece, I think we've wrapped our head around pretty well. There's certainly a conversation on the liberty front, given our incarceration rate here in the country, but for the most part, we've got life and liberty knocked out. That pursuit of happiness, however, is a really tricky piece of this statement and this social contract. The pursuit of happiness is this idea that we ought to be unencumbered to go figure out what we do, what we want to do well, and then have the tools to be successful in that pursuit. That pursuit of happiness piece is really the DEI core conversation that we ought to be having. And so as I share some of these definitions, it's really framing, it's framing how we live, how we stay alive, how we stay free perhaps, but it's really framing getting the tools and the understanding and the common ground to pursue happiness across our country. And that's the really important piece of this combo. So I'll start with diversity, just simply, purely as a definition, all of the ways that we are similar and different. And I think when we talk about diversity, we talk so much about the differences. He looks different than me. She is different than me by virtue of gender, sexual orientation differences. And we like to point out all of the differences when we talk about diversity. But what's really important here is we are talking not only about the differences, but the similarities, right? When I think about an organization, so some of the early stage startup companies that I've built, while we had a racial diversity, the diversity of thought, for the last company I built, we had 5 folks, all who came out of the same entrepreneurship program with the same degree. When I think about the similarities there, that says to me those first 5 hires were not a diverse group by any stretch of the imagination. One could argue because we had the white guy in the corner and me as the CEO, and we had the short guy and the tall guy, and we had all of these different pieces. We were all guys and we were all out of an entrepreneurship program, and there's an issue with that, and it's something that as I've been having these conversations, it's very much informed the way I look at the world and the way I do better work. And so I'll say, as we go into what may be an uncomfortable conversation, it shouldn't be, and we're approaching this from the lens of what can we do to be a little better, right? We're trying to move the needle forward, and a lot of that starts with acknowledging where we are and then making a commitment to shift that. So when I talk about you can't unsee it, a lot of it starts with us, and we'll drill into that a little later in this conversation. But the diversity piece, the similarities and the differences, both of which are crucial. Here's a small note on diversity from a definition standpoint, at least, is an individual can't be diverse. we tokenize the Black person or the Indian woman or the fill in the blank type of person as diverse. And the reality is, until we've got an environment that is reflective of the larger society, we are not, in fact, diverse. And that can't start with one person. That has to be a conscientious effort as we change the composition, the makeup, and the backgrounds of those who we are privileged to do work with. The second piece, inclusion. So we talk about diversity and inclusion a lot. Inclusion is a big piece of that, and it's a sense of purpose and belonging for all. So, it's not just being welcomed into the group, it's knowing what one's role is. So defining a role and defining where they fit in an organization, in agencies, in state government. But it's also that sense of belonging, right? I can know what my job is and show up to work and feel like I do my job well, but nobody wants me there. The flip side, I can feel like I'm in this great family of an organization. We talk about our work as our families sometimes. I can feel like I'm in this inclusive family, but I'm not sure why I'm there. I'm not sure what I do. And inclusivity, or driving toward inclusion, encompasses both pieces. And especially as we consider the sphere of influence or control for chief administrative officers in state government, we've got to consider both pieces. Not only knowing what we do and that we do it well, but knowing that we actually belong in the organization in which we exist and are tasked with different jobs. And so that sense of belonging and purpose for all is an important distinction there. And lastly, equity. Equity is this idea that everyone gets all of the support they need to succeed. And the equity conversation is a really critical one as we talk about DEI. I think DEI flows really well, but it really could be DIE, I suppose. Don't love how that spells out. But equity ends up at the end because it's such an important piece. And we kind of tacked it on more recently. We've just started talking about equity more holistically, and that's important. I'm glad we're here. And so here's an image that illustrates what we're thinking about and why we ought to be. It used to be equality was the core of our conversation. Everybody is equal. Everybody gets all the same resources. And, if we're in this meritocracy, the ones who are better will rise to the top and they'll be successful. That is a nice idea in theory, I suppose, but it's not the reality of our existence. And so equity in that second panel is really what we're trying to get to at this point. We are trying to get there, and quite frankly, we're not. But the idea of equity is that we have the support. So the person who's really short gets 2 boxes to stand on. The person who's somewhere in the middle of the pack gets a box to stand on. And if you're 6'4" like I am, you can see over the fence and see the ball game. Easy peasy, no problem. That is equity at its finest. The problem is that third pane, the reality of where we are is we've got some folks who are just starting in the hole. We've got that deficit. For those who have seen that there's a YouTube or Vimeo video floating around where the teacher is talking to his class, and he's got folks who are in the front row shooting a piece of paper into the trash can, and folks in the back of the class trying to make the same shot. That's where we are today. And we're trying to find some equity there in supporting the folks who might have been in the back of the class or in the hole here, and also supporting the folks who need more than one box to stand on, and also acknowledging that there are folks who have done a land grab and have all of the boxes to stand on out of the gate. And so when we talk about equity, it's not only getting to a place where we're supporting those who need the tools or are getting the tools they need to succeed. It's the conversation that we are not at a place of equity, especially if we've got folks who have all of the boxes. And so this brings me to an interesting point, and I'll have Claire kill the slides if you don't mind, and we'll continue the conversation without them for a few minutes. There's an interesting piece of this conversation when we talk about meritocracies, in considering that there are folks who have way more resources out of the gate. Is that good? Is it bad? I'll leave that on the audience to decide, but the conversation itself is real. And that brings us to the second piece that I hear thrown out a lot. You know, diversity, equity, inclusion is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not that somebody has to lose something in order for folks to gain. Perhaps that's true. If you think about that last image you just saw with one person with 9 boxes and everybody else just trying to get from 0 to 1, I suppose, we could make sure everybody else has 9 boxes. But there's a piece of our particular conversation around DEI here in America that does feel like a zero-sum game. But I'll tell you why. It's because we operate from this place of fear so often. If X group gets new rights, perhaps just gets to baseline on the rights they should have had out of the gate, then I don't have the ability to step on, over, or around them. If that is actually the equation, if that's actually the math that some of us do in our country, and the reality is that is some of the math. If they get rights, then I am not allowed to do the thing that makes me comfortable or that I have been doing for forever. It is not a zero-sum game in that respect. We actually do have to give up some of, they're not rights, but some of the privileges, I suppose, that we are afforded in order to get folks to baseline. We may not be able to step on, around, or through folks as we make sure we're getting to an equitable place in our country. So when I bring that up, it's because we're having real conversations right now across America. We're having a couple really big ones, right? When I think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the reality is something like 28% of African-American deaths, or excuse me, 28% of police deaths are of African-American descent, versus a 13% representation across our country, right? The disparity there and the inequity in how many folks are killed by the cops. That's a real conversation. It's factual. And that is part of why we're seeing that movement happen. We had and are not even at the tail end in the midst of the Me Too movement still. And it's because 35% of women have been subjected to some sexual trauma. That's another real stat. And when we think about the inequity there, you know, in that zero-sum game, men have to stop doing things to women for women to be in an equal place. That is real, and that's the right conversation to be having. And so the third big piece, being in the midst of a global pandemic, is considering that African Americans are 2 times more likely to die from COVID than any other racial group in our country. The second closest is Hispanics. And so when we consider inequities across the board, we wonder often why we're here. And I heard it said really well recently, when a pot of water boils over, you don't blame the pot, nor do you blame the water, you blame the flame beneath it. I think what we're seeing now in our country is this overcorrection, or an appropriate correction perhaps, for some of the systemic inequity that minority groups have experienced. There is a correction, and I think it's the right one. We've got to decide if we are going to push back and fight because we feel like we're losing something by bringing those minority groups into the fold, or if we're going to acknowledge that perhaps we are in this place because of the systems, because of the culture, because of the society we've built. And if we correct appropriately alongside those asking us to do it, will we get to a better place? So I want to jump into the data. Those are, you know, I shared some stats, but it's really easy to say, well, there are different reasons that we've gotten here, and there's some nuance to that. So I'm going to jump back and share my screen again really briefly. And while I'm doing that, it puts us in a really good position to see the data and then see how, in fact, that is affecting our decisions. The reality is when I talk about systemic inequity, a lot of it is not overt, right? We didn't get here because we didn't stay here, at least. I think we did get here because we saw people very differently years ago when we set our systems and built the foundation. But the reality is we don't stay here because we hate people, right? the reality is bias is what informs how we operate in the world and why we get some of the systems that we see today. So overt bias is really easy. Overt bias is you're sexist or you're racist, or you can throw in any other ism, and that'd be overt. And there are a lot of four-letter words or slightly longer ones to talk about folks with overt bias. You've just decided that you see groups a certain way and you want to interact with them differently. What I see most often is that the unconscious bias is what affects us so much as we interact with folks in our everyday life. And so what you've got in front of you right now is the Beagle Project. Came out of some academics from Vanderbilt and Georgia Tech and a couple other institutions. And Beagle stands for Bound Encoding of the Aggregate Language Environment. Basically what they did is they took 10 million samples of content, media, literature that your average college freshman would have consumed by the time they got to university. And they looked for a correlation between certain groups and terminology that was connected to them. So as you see here, the average college student would have most often seen poor in conjunction with black, or violent, or cheerful, or lazy, or dangerous. We've got one positive one in there. That's great for us, I suppose. But these are some of the highest correlated terms that you see associated with the word black. On the other side, you see wealthy and progressive, conventional, etc. For white. And what that means is we're taking the folks that we educate in this country and trying to understand how they see the world, or how they've perhaps been biased towards certain groups. And the literature, the things we consume, is a really good way to get an understanding or a baseline of how folks might operate in the world. I show black and white in contrast, but Beagle Project goes into a couple others. If you think about gender, women are seen as warm or caring or loving. Men are seen as dominant or assertive or aggressive. And, all of those pieces very much inform how we operate in the world. This brings us to a second one. This case study, it was two identical resumes that went out to something like 140 or so folks for a lab tech position. These are identical except for the name. The name is the only thing changed on the resume. And what you see is there is inherent bias even when we look at resumes. And this, HR folks are typically the folks that we talk about as instituting DEI programs and thinking about unconscious bias. But we also see that the inequity manifests in the HR world, particularly as you look at Jennifer Smith and John Smith. When resumes are submitted, both resumes were submitted side by side, and folks looked at these resumes, and what we found is that there was a 30% disparity between the initial hiring offer for Jennifer and John. John was offered $30 something thousand, almost 31 grand, whereas Jennifer was offered $26,500, roughly 30% delta there. And what we find is not only is it the starting pay rate that perhaps perpetuates the inequity, that gender wage gap, the 62 cents on the dollar for Black women, or 57 cents on the dollar for Hispanic women, or 90 cents or 70 cents on the dollar for Asian and white women respectively. But what we see is the competence rating that the hiring managers were asked to look at was different as well. Jennifer was rated at 3.3 out of 5 competent, where John was rated 4 out of 5. Identical resumes again, and the only explanation there is that we have some biases that have been ingrained in our culture. And the last one I'd like to talk about is in healthcare, particularly again, because we're in the middle of COVID. Hispanic patients versus white patients in an ER, data was normalized for background and insurance and language. And what they looked at were patients with long bone fracture, so femur fracture, within 6 hours of being admitted to the ER, and the long bone fracture, 6 hours into the ER, and no alcohol involved in the injury. What we found is that Hispanic patients were 7.5 less likely to receive pain medication, same injury, all data normalized. So 55% of Hispanic patients didn't get pain meds for the same injury, whereas 26% of white patients didn't get pain meds. When we think about that inequity in healthcare, where doctors leverage data to make decisions about how they provide care, we see the inequity as this really stark contrast here as well. So I've kind of touched on the gender and the hiring and the healthcare. Those are really big pieces of the conversation. But it brings us to this idea as we just about wrap up, is that we see diversity, equity, and inclusion in our agencies, in our companies, in our organizations as this thing that we have to navigate because of liability. Often we think about it from a standpoint of liability. We look at protected classes and we make sure we're not inequitable toward them and not discriminating against them because of the litigious nature of our society, perhaps. What I would suggest is that we have a better opportunity here, and it's looking at diversity as an opportunity. From a bottom line perspective, we see an excellent increase and a substantial increase in bottom line and revenue driven when we bring diverse groups into our company. We see a shift in culture where folks are happy to come into the office and know what they're supposed to do and enjoy the people around them when we shift from protecting or mitigating risk to looking for opportunity. And that's driven by our people. It's driven by the folks we leave around us. So I'll have Claire kill the slides again as we wrap up, and I'll leave you with a couple really easy thoughts. The big one is that as CAOs, as folks who work in state government, as we drive toward having these inclusive agencies, the reality is we're in the position of power to shift the narrative, to shift the conversation, and to drive towards equity, mitigate inequity, and make sure we've got inclusive cultures with a diverse organization. That's the biggest piece, is that we are in the driver's seat in a lot of respects to shift who represents our agencies across state government, how and where we put money into the hands of underrepresented groups. That is not only an opportunity, but it's a responsibility to consider that. That's the consideration of how we hire, right? I talked a little bit about meritocracy. It's how we hire, how we bring folks in. Do we overhaul HR? Perhaps. I'd say each state has their own policies for how they hire. But what we ought to consider is, if we're looking at the kid who was in the hole and that trying to see over the fence image, if we look at the kid who was in the hole and we look at the guy who was on top of 9 or 10 boxes, if we think about meritocracy, we're asking ourselves if one person is equal to the other person and if we'd hire one over the other. That's perhaps the wrong question. We've got to consider where they came from, what they've accomplished to get into the hiring process, and what their resume perhaps doesn't say as that resume is sitting in front of us. The second big piece is mission and vision. As we craft those for our agencies, are we considering what we say in our mission and vision? And all of us often have a diversity or equity or inclusion statement in that mission or vision, but are we living up to that? Are we truly creating the culture that allows us to do great work with great people? I touched a little bit on policing. Does that fall right in the sphere of influence? Probably not. But is there an opportunity to shift or work with other state agencies to make sure we're doing the right thing because of how it affects our own people in our own organizations? And then lastly, the procurement piece, as dollars flow into minority or women-owned businesses, are we truly, in the same way we think about hiring, considering what it took for an underprivileged or a person from a community of color to shift and get to the place where they're looking at an RFP and moving forward? Those are the questions we ought to be asking. And now that we've put some data and some color and some context to how we got here, where we are, and perhaps how we move forward, what I challenge you is twofold. To internalize some of the data that we just looked at. I suggest that we see it now and we can't unsee it. And the second piece is Harvard put out a great test. It's called the implicit association test, and it helps us navigate or wrap our head around our own biases. It gives you some rapid questions to respond to. Let's look at our own biases and let's start from understanding we're in positions of power, places of privilege, and can affect or shift some policy and some operations. So we've got to start with ourselves and understand where we're coming from and how we go out and interact with the people we work with. So again, now that we see it, I suggest and I challenge you to not only see it, but know that you can't unsee it, and we've got to move forward and do better work than we already have from here. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ace, so much. I wish we could all give you a round of applause. This is me giving you a round of applause. I don't know if you can see everyone here really applauding you. We appreciate your thought leadership in this space and really helping NASCA intentionally walk through this conversation. So we thank you so much. Ace is going to be moderating the next session, so I'll give him a second to sit down and grab his water. But what we're going to do is we're going to launch a Slido question now. And so for those of us who are just now joining, if this is your first session, what this is you're going to go to slido.com, and it looks like our team is pulling this up for you, what it will look like. And in slido.com, you can either do this in a browser or on your phone. You're going to get a prompt. And the prompt is going to ask you, where are you on this spectrum? Are you just getting started? Are you beginning to introduce yourself to concepts? Are you moving along or just learning more? Or is your state and yourself are you rocking it? So I see we're getting people responding right now. You should be up on the screen, see how it's moving as people are responding. We're getting great responses. It looks like a lot of people are kind of moving along. They've started the journey. We've got a couple just started, a couple with decades of experience. They're rocking it, they're doing it. We know that all of our members and all of our states are at different places on the journey, as well as individually where people are along the journey. Yeah, we're getting some great responses here. Lots of people kind of moving along. So this will really help our panelists know, as well as our moderator know, where people are in this room. So thank you guys so much for doing that Slido prompt. Great responses here. So what we're going to do now, I want to just take some time that we have this little break, this little refresher, to thank our sponsors and those who make NASCA possible. So we have many of them on the call today, and I just want to say NASCA would not be possible without our sponsors on the call, both those who provide support as well as our two media partners, Governing and Route 50. So we really want to thank them. That's who sustain NASCA and who's make NASCA really being able to move forward. I also want to thank our working group. So we actually got a call together with some of our executive committee, some state leaders, some of our corporate partners, and tried to talk about, as we did this virtual conference, what should we do? And so I really appreciate our working group. One of those being someone that you will hear from here in a minute, Cara Beach and Janelle Ford and Leslie Crane, saying, if we're not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we're not really diving deep into this, we're missing some great content to give to the states. So we really wanted to thank that working group for the intentional guidance and direction on focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion as an association. I also want to talk about what we're getting ready to do. So we're getting ready to have a panel of 5 amazing leaders, and I'll introduce them. But after that panel, then we're going to have 2 what we call fast talks in NASCA. They're going to be quick, punchy, 20-minute talks. First, we're going to hear from Deloitte, and then we're going to hear from LinkedIn, and then we're going to do breakouts. So at about 4:45 Eastern time, we'll go into breakouts where you will actually get to have peer-to-peer connections with people all across the country. So we're trying our best to recreate the peer-to-peer connections. That's why we're using Zoom today, so you guys can see everyone's faces. We're really trying to do as much as possible to make this engaging. So also feel free to comment in chat. What was your favorite takeaway from ACE's last keynote? What was your favorite takeaway from a comment Janelle Ford said? What was your favorite comment from what Secretary Sanders said? So really use chat to connect. And NASCA is all about connections, all about public sector, private sector, people across the nation sitting side by side and learning. And so with all that, I'm getting ready to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Janelle Ford. She is on our NASCA Executive Committee, and we also really appreciate her guidance and leadership during this time. But she is the director of the Department of Central Management Services, CMS, in the state of Illinois. We'll also hear from Jason Jackson. Jason is actually also our research and policy chair, so I also really appreciate his thought leadership As we're going through COVID, financial crisis, everything that's happening in the nation, really shaping the research and policy that NASCA is putting out. So thank you, Jason, and thank you so much to the state of Nebraska. We also have Cara Beach. You heard from Cara in the intro. She has an amazing op-ed about what's happening in Colorado and Route 50 and how they're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion in recruiting and HR and the workforce. Cara is on our executive committee. She is the executive director of the Department of Personnel and Administration for the state of Colorado. We will also hear from Leslie Crane. Leslie is also on our NASCA executive committee, and Leslie was also chairing this conference when we were going to have it in person. And so I thank her for all of her leadership and guidance when we had to pivot so quickly to make what we were going to do in person and what we had all planned to do to virtual. And so thank you so much. Leslie is the commissioner of the Department of Administration for the state of Indiana. And finally, we'll hear today from Michelle Sanders. Michelle is the Secretary of the Department of Administration for North Carolina. And so with that, Ace, I will hand it over to you to moderate our panel.
I'm talking to myself on mute. I promised I wouldn't do that this entire session, and I did it. Jamie, much appreciated. Thanks for the intro of the just incredible panelists we've had. I have had the conversation about today's session with a couple folks, and so we framed a few questions. I'd imagine we'll get into a more organic conversation, but I want to start as a question for all of our panelists with very simply, what's the DEI vision for your direct control or direct sphere of influence? And I know that spans a couple things: procurement, HR, culture, IT, facilities, et cetera, quite a few places. And so what I'd like to ask is from a very high level, what's the vision for DEI? And I'm gonna jump to Janelle out of the gate, maybe 60 seconds or so, and then we'll work down the line from there.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. There we go. Okay. So we got one thing right today. So first of all, I want to say thank you to NASCA. Thank you to the sponsors, and Ace, thank you for your keynote, your intro. I was diligently taking notes during the conversation. So for CMS, Central Management Services, at the highest level, for us, we oversee procurement, facilities. That includes leasing, so where people actually are situated across the state of Illinois, HR, and then we also, as part of our personnel function, also have a Bureau for Diversity and Inclusion. For us, for me, I will distill just very basically kind of our approach, which is one, of course, to be inclusive, but it's also two, to be respectful. I think one of the things you said, Ace, in the beginning of your talk was, you know, we hope that some of these conversations aren't uncomfortable. I would challenge that a bit. They are uncomfortable conversations to have because we have to challenge the systems, our personal beliefs, our practices, our policies, and that is not comfortable personally, and it's not comfortable as a system, as a bureaucracy. But for us, because we do oversee so much, because I think leadership in government is important, because we impact our constituents' lives in so many ways, whether hiring, whether it's about promotion and performance while they're actually employees, or whether it's about, you know, how we either structure our contracts, to whom we award contracts, how do we treat our vendors. For me, a lot of the work that CMS stands behind and Governor Pritzker and Lieutenant Governor Stratton stand behind is respect for persons, their lived experiences, what they bring to the table. And then for us, the way that we will, I know we'll talk a little bit more about it later, how we've been thinking about how we can be better, do better, challenge ourselves, has really been around being honest around what we haven't done well, what we need to be doing better at, but also understanding the challenges that different groups of folks, individuals, actually have in accessing government, accessing hiring, accessing procurement. And so again, for us, I think as we take a step back and really respect the individual and their experience, that has been leading our conversations around what do we do, how do we serve, both large and small ways.
Great, Janelle, much appreciated. And I like the respecting individuals and the access piece. I'm gonna jump to Leslie. Leslie, vision in Indiana for DEI in your agency.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, everybody, my video isn't working today, so you just get audio. I would echo everything that Janelle just said. I think on a broad spectrum, I agree with that. In Indiana, DOA is really the only agency that has a statutory responsibility in this kind of minority women, veteran-owned business kind of area. So I feel like for our mission, one of our key responsibilities and missions is to keep the pressure on and to keep bringing it up, because it's very easy for it to slip through the cracks and for it not to be a priority. So we have to keep bringing it up and keep forcing tough conversations. I don't have the responsibility for hiring, so I don't get to kind of poke at it from that angle, but we keep the pressure on in procurement, we keep the pressure on in the certification of businesses. And so we do what we can to maintain DEI as a priority in every sphere of influence that we have. So from that angle, we do our best to be a squeaky wheel, I think is the best way to put it.
Squeaky wheel. I like that. Thank you, Leslie. I'm going to jump to Jason. Jason, in Nebraska, how are you thinking about DEI and what's the vision? Where are you heading?
Thanks, Ace. Appreciate it. When Governor Ricketts came into office, we lacked a mission and a vision statement for state government. So one of the first things we did is declare a vision of growing Nebraska, and through a mission of creating opportunity through efficient, effective, and customer-focused state government. And we know that we can't grow our state if we leave people behind. So I wear a couple of hats. I'm the HR officer for the state. And from that perspective, I really like Cara's formulation of saying, hey, we want a government that reflects those that we serve. As the chief administrative officer, it's about, from that customer service, customer focused perspective, how are we creating a state government that's accessible to everyone, easy to navigate, and where there's equitable benefits that accrue across the breadth of all those that we serve. So those are kind of generalities. Some very specific goals that we have that we're pretty proud of are, one, we want to be the foremost employer in the state of Nebraska for veterans, and we want to be the foremost employer in the state of Nebraska for new moms. And so those have been two areas where we've applied some very specific energy, and we very much hope to continue to kind of grow and build upon those lines of effort.
Great. Jason, thank you. I'm going to pop over to Michelle in North Carolina. What are you doing? Where are you heading?
Sure, thank you, Ace. In North Carolina, we are working and continue to strive to be a leader to both public and private industries by modeling equity, diversity, and inclusion through the initiatives and policies that we put forth. Fortunately, we have a Governor Roy Cooper, who understands that diversity drives our economy, innovation, and ideas. And he has a vision for our state, for every resident in the state to be healthier, better educated, and to have more money in their pockets so that they can live a prosperous and abundant life. Within the agency, the Department of Administration, we are responsible for government operations, as well as we have an advocacy arm, and we advocate for underserved residents across the state. And so it is more than important, I would say, that not only do we internalize the importance and the understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion as we talked about today, but it is important that we deliver those services in a way that we are not only meeting the needs of almost 11 million residents across the state on diverse and from all backgrounds, but internally, that we are creating a culture where inclusion and diversity is not only embraced, but is celebrated. So as a secretary, when I began in the Department of Administration, I identified 3 imperatives that really align with the governor's vision and align with the overall mission of the Department of Administration statutorily, as well as the efficiencies and effectiveness we want to bring about. And one of those imperatives is to create a culture of trust through enhanced employee engagement, openness, and inclusiveness. So where we are headed and what we are doing is continuing to put forth initiatives, employee resource groups, policies, and ways of connecting and working with people so that we gain a greater understanding of not only the importance of equity and inclusion for each person internally and in our communities, but what it means to our economy, what it means to our education systems, what it means to healthcare and our environmental systems, and most importantly, what it means to the lives and the hearts and souls of every North Carolinian in the state of North Carolina.
Michelle, thank you for that. That culture of trust is something I talk about in my work so often, and it's really hard to have those uncomfortable conversations, to Janelle's point, if you are not, in fact, in a trusting environment where you can hear what somebody's saying and know that they're coming from a place of intentionality, at least, and honesty to have that combo. So I want to jump to Cara and hear what you're up to in Colorado and what your vision for DEI is out west, from me at least.
Great, thank you. We are fortunate that Governor Polis's campaign slogan was a Colorado for all. And so we very easily took that and applied it in the EDI space, as well as economic opportunity, access to healthcare, and saving people money in healthcare, and opportunities around education. So we are focusing on a few areas in EDI, or not first, maybe top of mind for me right now is leadership. So last year, at the end of about 18 months ago, we did a survey. We do an employee engagement survey every 2 years, and we added a question that says, I see leadership support of equity, diversity, inclusion. And 50.7%, half of our employees felt that leaders were leading in this area. We have so much work to do. So we have convened an EDI cabinet. We are offering training to leaders. So we've developed a 4-module training for all supervisors and managers. Like many states, we are looking at how we recruit, retain, and develop employees. So I would love to know someone who's doing this well, implementing skills-based hiring. If anyone's doing that well, please give me a shout out. We're really looking at it. It's a tough one. We have a constitutional restriction that only allows us to talk to 6 people. So Ace, your example of the resume was so critical and poignant for me as we engage in these discussions. We are also looking and re-examining recruiting strategies. How are we reaching into communities? How do we understand their life experiences and what we can bring forth? We are also doing training for all employees. So along with the mandatory compliance training that we've already done, we have a 4-module EDI training that we will be pushing out to everyone. And then we are in the middle of a disparity study for procurement. So I know a lot of you have already done this and have implemented this well, but you really can't do a lot in the procurement area without first demonstrating there's a disparity. I'm sure we're going to demonstrate a disparity. So looking forward to making real difference as we distribute the billions of dollars we spend every year, and not just thinking about, do we spend 10% on historically underutilized businesses, but how are we making sure that 10% of all professional services are going to historically underutilized businesses? How are we slicing each layer to distribute that around historically underutilized businesses rather than 10% off the top, which tends to go to those lower paying jobs and do not help change generational wealth. So really focusing on that. Those are kind of the big areas for us. And Janelle, I saw that, so I'll reach out to you.
Actually, you know, I told the panelists we would throw the questions out the window probably after the first or second one. And I acknowledge that NASCA is having this organization to share resources. So I'm going to jump ahead to one of the questions, which was, how can NASCA help here? And I think connections like these. So Janelle just dropped a note to Cara's point on skills-based hiring. Janelle, can you speak briefly about what you're doing in Illinois to move that needle and maybe not just for Cara, but for the rest of the group can get some benefit there?
Sure. So Actually, sorry, I've got some Zoom issues. So just really quickly, I'm going to answer 2 questions real quick. I think NASCA being in a role to convene the conversations, to facilitate the dissemination and the sharing of ideas of thought partnership and resources is so, so, so critical. I wish I could show you. I have sticky notes in addition to my pieces of paper here for my follow-up action items, because even though I've met with these folks before, new insight and new connection points have come up for me. So I want to encourage people who are part of NASCA. If you're not, be part of it. Use the boards. It's great. But okay, now I'm going to move back on to the question. In terms of we call it hiring reform here in the state of Illinois. Long story short, our processes were 99% paper-based. I don't need to go into all of the biases that could be inherent in a paper-based process. We last year kicked off the internal process for hiring reform, where now our new positions are posted, non-union positions are posted using an online system. We're currently partnered with NeoGov in that endeavor. We're working with other partners as well. But the long story short is we literally had an opportunity to have a generational shift in how we think about hiring people. And so as we're building our online systems, we've literally taken a step back to not just think about efficiency, not just think about throwing away the paper and getting into, you know, the 21st century and using actual technology, but also to be thinking about what does real recruitment look like? You know, how do we actually understand what diversity is? How do we track it? How do we if it's important to us, right? Where are the stage gates in our processes where we stop to ask ourselves questions around why certain populations or individuals in certain populations have fallen out of our system? What does that mean around what we propose to be an unbiased system? How are we learning real time and how are we adjusting? And then again, that system learning loop. So we are by no means in a place to say that we are perfect or that we don't still have more learning to do, quite the opposite. But what I will tell you is we have been head first into this process since 2019. I think we've made a lot of great progress. And I think the learnings that we have and that we're still implementing could be helpful as cautionary tales. And I think in some cases, best practices for our partners who might be in different stages and spaces. And then conversely, what I would say is we're also happy to learn. So as we are evolving in this process, you know, another agency or another municipality on this call may say, you know, we have some really great insights around interview questions. We'd love to share that information. I think again, for us, government, and I'll get on my soapbox one more time and just say that, you know, having worked in private sector and having worked in government, I think a lot of focus on professional development, on really helping employees become their best versions of themselves in their jobs has not been a focus of government and has not been the focus of public sector. And so now when we challenge people to be focused more on skills, not just on a job spec that's 20 years old, now that we're challenging people to work in different ways, to use different skill sets, it is harder, I think, for us to manage. And quite frankly, if you can't manage, you can't lead. And so for us, we look at our human capital management system that we're implementing in 2021/22. We look at our hiring reform process that kicked off last year and actually thinking about how we can better serve our employees from recruitment to coming in our pipeline and to actually being employees that, you know, are happy and proud to be and fulfilled working for the state of Illinois. So again, happy to share any information that we have. My head of personnel, my head of D&I, my head of project management and data practice are also, and I think Rapid Results are also on this call. So we'll take down your information if you shout us out in the comments, but also happy to connect offline if that's helpful.
Ace?
Thank you. Thank you. I saw a couple notes flying. It seems like quite a few folks have gotten value from that. So Janelle, much appreciated. I want to switch gears a little bit. We just talked about all of the things we're doing just in such a good way. Where are we missing the mark? And I'm gonna jump to Leslie out of the gate, and we'll see who else has comments. But Leslie, you know, you're doing so much great work in Indiana. What are you missing the mark on?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a fair question. I think, well, like I mentioned earlier, you know, it's hard to be a one-stop shop where we're constantly being that squeaky wheel. I will say we have an all-agency meeting tomorrow, and one of the things we're trying to talk about is, you know, how to have those hard conversations that we've heard referenced a few times. My agency is pretty diverse. I think we talked about that in our prep call, that, you know, if you looked across the census data, ours is pretty representative of what Indiana is, so it's fairly diverse. And we've talked as an executive team about how to talk about kind of what's been unfolding here in Indiana and across the country, so that people know that when they come to work, it's a safe place for them. And if something happens to them that's not okay, that they can come here and talk about it, and how to bring those hard conversations up. And we haven't settled on a good way to have those conversations. And one other thing I would bring up is that I don't think there's a good answer for. We talked about in the call that kind of birthed this thought series. Janelle and I had a similar experience with our responsibility for facilities. We had some damage in the time of the more heated protests on state grounds, and we spent some time and some money cleaning them up. And then we had floated the notion of, is it the right thing to do to clean it up? Should we leave it? I mean, are we aggravating some social heat by cleaning it up? And should we leave it? And that's a conversation that I think maybe things have obviously certainly calmed down here. And I don't think there's a good answer for that. And I think Janelle had a similar experience. So I don't know that any of that is bad, but I think some of that is maybe unresolved.
Unresolved and perhaps a bit uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
I hear that, especially as someone, so I'm based in Richmond, Virginia, former capital of the Confederacy, with I think the leading tally on second place trophies still standing in our city. So, you know, I can get the dilemma between cleaning things up after they've been vandalized or leaving the context perhaps from the other side of the conversation. So I want to transition a little bit before we get into breakout rooms, because we've got some incredible breakout rooms and a rapid talk from Deloitte coming up. As we wind down with the panelists, I want to throw out a rapid prompt. So I've got a couple here, but I'll pick the one that I liked the most. The best value your agencies have offered towards DEI has been fill in the blank. And I'd like to start with Jason for that one. The best value that your agency has offered toward DEI has been fill in the blank. Jason, thought?
I'm going to give a tactical answer to what probably is more deserving of a loftier concept given the conversation here, but I'll say data. And that would be my answer to also what our biggest opportunity is. You know, in ACE, I think it related very closely to your keynote as well. When we have data, then we can identify opportunities, we can identify problems, we can form hypotheses, and we can test solutions. In the absence of data, it's tough to know we have a problem, and oftentimes I think many of us have blind spots for what the issues are. So I'll use one example in Nebraska. Law enforcement nationally is about 13% female. In our state law enforcement agency, our state trooper organization, we're at 6% female. So we could, you know, there's probably a conversation to have about whether or not 13% is the right number, probably not, but certainly 6% isn't, given that benchmark. And so with that data in hand, we can look at, okay, are we systemically creating barriers in terms of our hiring process to matriculate women into our organization? Or are we creating barriers in the organization itself that bars women from being successful? So that's an example of where I think our agency and administrative services and state personnel can aid decision makers in terms of driving the right conversations and testing solutions to help make sure that, you know, like I talked about at the jump, that we're creating great customer experiences for those that we're serving, and also creating a workforce that everybody feels they can enjoy that spirit of inclusivity and team.
Awesome, thank you. I want to jump to Michelle on the same thing. Best value your agency is offering on the DEI front is fill in the blank.
I'd say the best value that the Department of Administration in North Carolina is offering to D&I is courageous leadership. We push the boundaries and we work fearlessly for those who are underserved across the state, as well as all of our other residents. But through our work, there have been results and deliverables that have had a meaningful impact internally, as well as with the residents. For example, with the governor's leadership and with our work, he has created and implemented executive orders that promote health and wellness and protections for pregnant employees. He's also created recently 2 task forces, one on social, environmental, and societal inequities, another on the racial injustice and inequity in the state criminal system. There have been changes to our hiring practices. For example, on applications, you no longer have to list your salary history, because we know, based on data, as well as I know firsthand as a female, that many times the salary is based on what you write on the paper, which puts many females at an even larger gap in salary, and because of the gender wage gap with men. Our Council for Women provides research and data and reports that not only support the measures that we push for and that we implement, but they have been courageous in voicing and sharing the information across the state, bringing awareness to it. Within the Department of Administration, our historically underutilized business program, I would say, is not only an advocate for small minority women business and small businesses, but is an advocate for building capacity and capabilities within North Carolina that will have a great return on our economy, which we all want a thriving economy. So those are a few actions that the department has either contributed to, initiated, or led. And of course, the return on the investment of time, heart, leadership, and hard work is going to result in a benefit to our economy, a benefit to every resident in the state through that economic improvement, and also to our state employees. So I would say that the Department of Administration in North Carolina is fortunate to have a leadership team that consistently amplifies and exemplifies courageous behaviors, and ones that really speak for the voices of many who think they are voiceless or their voices aren't heard. We love doing that, we enjoy doing that, and then we have the great benefit and honor of keeping government on its tracks and running at the same time. So the diversity in the agency itself gives us a real joy and thrill for the state of North Carolina.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. Time, heart, leadership, and hard work. I loved part of your closing right there. So I want to turn to the audience now, and we're going to launch a Slido poll, and Claire, you can run that. Going to launch a Slido poll, and what I'd love is if you dropped your biggest takeaway from this session, both keynote and panel discussion, most importantly, the panel discussion where we were sharing ideas across states. So you should see a Slido poll up on the screen. If you haven't logged into Slido, it's slido.com. NASCA20 is the password to get in, and start dropping some thoughts on biggest takeaway from today's convo. We'll keep this up for another 90 seconds or so, and then we will jump into Deloitte's Fast Talk, which Cara will tee up for us, and I'm very much looking forward to. So we'll let this word bubble build a little bit while we're getting prepped for that.
This is looking so good, Ace. I'm going to do the intro to the next session, but this is fascinating watching all these results come in.
Yeah, I'm seeing data as the big one, and Jason touched on that. Aggregating data in Nebraska helps make better decisions. I heard from Janelle, if you can't manage, you can't lead. And what's interesting is if you don't measure it, you can't manage it when I think about data. So, we've got to have metrics and data outlined so we can get to some managerial decisions so we can ultimately lead our organizations. So I like seeing data right there in the middle. Can we measure it? Do we know what our baseline is? And then can we move forward from there? I like that a lot. All right, so we got a good feel from Slido. I'm going to hand it over to Jamie in the other NASCA studio, and we'll get kicked off for our next session.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, I wish we could all have the round of applause, the virtual jazz hands. That was amazing. Thank you to our panelists. I know we are just getting started in this conversation, and we hope to have many more of these conversations. Really learning from our panelists. I want to spend an hour, multiple hours with all of them. So I want to thank Secretary Sanders in North Carolina and her team that's on the line. Leslie Crane, we couldn't see you, but we have been listening to you and I'm hearing from you and really appreciate your leadership in Indiana as well as on this virtual conference. Cara Veach from Colorado, thank you so much. Jason Jackson from Nebraska for leading all of our research and policy, and as well Janelle Ford from Illinois. Again, a round of applause. Thank you. I see people giving them the hands, the high fives. It was amazing to hear from you guys. So now we're going to go into 2 fast talks. And so those are going to be a quick 20-minute talk. For any of us that's come to a NASCA in-person conference, you've experienced this fast talk. It's supposed to get you excited, really touch on everything that we're going to do and just kind of spark the conversation. So I'm really excited to have Kwesi Mitchell today from Deloitte. Kwesi is an expert in guiding security and law enforcement officer executives through strategic, operational, and workforce transformations to address emerging security threats. He's a principal at Deloitte's consulting and government practice. He's been championing recruiting diverse candidates through Deloitte's first ever inclusion hiring blitz. He is also a leader in the diversity and inclusion for Deloitte on initiatives focused around female, minority, veteran, and LGBT practitioners at Deloitte. Kwesi volunteers for the Urban Alliance Foundation, and one of my favorite things here is it looks like he enjoys Spin Studio, traveling with his wife, and then sharpening his piano skills. So it's amazing to learn from you, and the floor is yours. So once you unmute yourself, we will spotlight you and hear from you.
Yes, and thank you so much for the introduction. And I did want to thank the panelists again. I thought it was a great panel, not solely because Jason stole a little bit of my thunder with respect to this particular talk, which is going to be about data and analytics. But I couldn't hope for a better intro when we naturally segue into this particular discussion. So just to give you a sense, I have a variety of roles within Deloitte, but I currently serve as our DEI lead for our consulting practice. And that is a practice of about 55,000 people across 4 different countries and close to 30 or so different career models. So complex organization with a variety of different needs from the standpoint of our focus with respect to DEI. I have a few slides, if we don't mind pulling those up. And on these slides, I'll talk through a few different things with you. First and foremost, to give you a sense, and this ties to an earlier poll question, which I thought was fantastic. And that poll question specifically centered around if people were starting along their particular journey. And if you take a look at the next slide, you'll see that, we at Deloitte have been on this journey focused on DEI for close to 25 years. Initially heavily focused on the advancement of women, that has then progressed to a focus on our minorities, a focus on veterans, and really starting to pinpoint different aspects of people's careers and life trajectories as to when we want to lean in and support our employees in their path through the firm to really be able to achieve not only an inclusive working environment, but in addition to that, being highly, highly focused on helping them become everything that they would like to be from a career standpoint. Now, when you take a look at the next slide, what you'll see is really the way that we think about how you drive inclusion, in particular DEI, across the different aspects within the firm. So frequently we hear people say, I have a strategy around DEI, I'm going to go implement that. And that strategy sometimes has some of these distinct aspects. And what I'll say is, first and foremost, the foundational items that we have flagged here are just the core infrastructure that you need to put in place around things like strategy, culture, data, process is key and can't be overlooked. And that really cascades into an evaluation of not only talent and the programs that you create, but also the culture that needs to be nimble and shift, because the focus areas with respect to DEI, from my experience, pivot frequently on a year-to-year basis and really needing to be responsive. So that's really the foundation that you need to build to have a strong program. Now, when you think about the way that you differentiate the way things that you do, it's really a combination of, are you really matching, the needs and the expectations of your customers or constituents? Are you aligned as a community with all of those that serve you and that supports you? And this is something that, particularly over the last 2 to 3 months, I've seen increase substantially, where different organizations are asking their suppliers, the people that they collaborate with, what are their goals and how collectively they can all work to hold each other accountable. And ultimately the brand that's in place. And lastly, this really gets to kind of enabling areas. And the one in particular that I'll talk about over the next 2 slides is around analytics. And ultimately, it's not solely pulling together data for data's sakes, but how you transform that data into a means by which you can pinpoint specific areas of challenge and also act upon them. So if we take a look at the next slide, what you'll see is the data-driven approach that we have towards DEI at Deloitte. And first and foremost, what we have is a collection of metrics and reports that tie to distinct aspects of our employee lifecycle. So how many people are we hiring? Who is exiting the firm? Who is being promoted? How are people, what's the demographics associated with our leadership teams? Such that if you look across that particular life cycle, including how we develop people and who is selected for specific development programs, we can make determinations and provide increased visibility on our, not only the challenges that we have, but how we can address those challenges. So from a visibility standpoint, we have, our workforce is quite young. I would say we have 4 different generations within our workforce, skewed heavily towards those who are younger than the age of 30. So we have plenty of calls for visibility and making clear to our teams and our staff that, when you think about DEI data and how you drive and make decisions on it, never forget the importance of, or the challenges with respect to handling that PII, but that it's really critical that when you're handling this data, that you're placing data in the hands of people who can act upon it. A challenge I've seen a number of times with respect to organizations is that they will have DEI data that will sit within a siloed part of the organization in the hands of 4 to 5 people that really prevents, leaders who are making decisions on who they hire, who joins their team, how do they utilize them on their team, how do they promote them. And if they're doing that in an equitable fashion, they're preventing from doing so. So really, when you think about the visibility of the data, placing it in the hands of the people who can act upon that data while simultaneously protecting the PII is absolutely critical for progress. Now, how do we use the data? Generally, what we do is that we have distinct types of data that we will perform analysis on a periodic basis. And I'll give you an example, a detailed example in just a moment. And that particular, that analysis we do on effectively a quarterly basis, right? Because the key thing that I have noticed in my experience has been, if you are being successful with your efforts, you will notice that your DEI challenges will in fact change. And really making sure that you don't continue to solve the problem today, which has not really been a problem for 5 years. And an example of that, for years for us within our firm, we had challenges from a recruiting standpoint, where we did not feel like we were getting our fair share off of college campuses, for example, of women and also of minorities. So we implemented a series of distinct items and then had this kind of legacy that, or excuse me, this hypothesis and this belief that was still in place that like that was our core challenge. And only by doing analysis of data on a quarterly or annual basis can you get people to focus away from that particular challenge to really what we're really addressing right now within our organization of retention of our people who are 2 to 3 to 4 years within their career, right? And so ultimately having that usage and that recurrence of the evaluation such that you can get to that point is key. And lastly, accountability, data and analysis without accountability, I feel is in many respects leaves you in a pretty challenged position to drive impact. So from an accountability standpoint, we do a number of distinct items. We do goal our leaders towards specific items that are in their control. So for example, if you run part of the organization, does that part of the organization actively groom and recruit women and people of color, for example? We also are very key on making sure that the efforts that are taking place in things along the talent life cycle, as I addressed before, like recruiting, are we hiring off of campuses, to the same degree with which that is reflective of the demographics of the campus? Or, for example, if we are hiring an experienced hire, are we tracking that for the women who exit the organization that we have a pipeline of diverse candidates that we could bring in at any point in time? And along all of those individual items, we're holding people accountable based upon their role within the organization. Now, the last slide that I'll show you here is just a detailed example of how we do this in action. So, for example, we have been very focused on data that we built into what we call a consulting inclusion dashboard, right? And that is a fair amount of representative data, specifically around women, minorities, and veterans. And with respect to this data, we probe distinct questions, such as what percentage of our senior consultants, which is a mid-career professional for us, are men versus women, minorities versus non-minorities? Are we seeing high attrition at specific levels? Are we seeing there being a lengthy period of time that people are spending at levels that is differentiated between, let's say, our minorities and non-minorities? And when we're able to probe things in that particular fashion, we're able to get to a point where we can pinpoint specific issues in very minor parts of the organization and customize our strategies and our actions in a way that historically we were unable to do due to the lack of this data and our increasing ability to analyze it and drive actions from it. Now, what I will say in closing is I do love the conversations and the key ends associated with data. I think that reporting and also distinct analysis of this nature are very, very key from the standpoint of being able to show definitive progress. And I would say the thing I would highly encourage all of you as well is how we think tactically about making that data available to the people who really can make decisions, while also updating others on the progress that we're fundamentally making in these areas. So with that, I hope that was a helpful overview. Ace, I believe I'm turning it back over to you.
There we go. Thank you so much for that, Kwasi. That fast talk from Deloitte, great way to get kicked off as we go into our next. The thing that stood out there, and of course, I think you referenced Jason in Jason's comments from Nebraska, and the data-driven approach to DEI is so important. Again, Janelle alluded to this as well, but what stood out is that data plus accountability equals impact is something you said. And I think that is just so appropriate for the conversation we're having. And again, looking back at the word cloud from Slido, the thing that I think resonated with so many people. So with that, I know we've got an intro to Cecily from LinkedIn, and I'll turn it over to Jamie for that.
Yeah, thank you again, Kwasi. And if you guys have a question, feel free to drop it in the comments or anything that really resonated with what you're doing in your state. Data, accountability, having those conversations. Thank you guys for your guys' thought leadership in this space. Definitely something that our members have been asking about. So we really appreciate all of that. So thank you so much for being with us today. So next up, we have both Cecily and Jay from LinkedIn. Cecily has worked in HR with diversity, talent, attraction, and retention strategies with dozens of government. Before joining LinkedIn, she was a corporate human resource, worked with corporate human resource clients, and she began her work on Capitol Hill. We also have Jay with us today. Jay is a general manager for LinkedIn Talent Solutions for state and local government. He works with the public sector and higher education. And he works with LinkedIn's Talent Solution Group. So I'm really excited to work with both Jay and Cecily and hand over the stage to them for our next Fast Talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. Really appreciate it. I'm going to assume everyone can hear me. If you can't, you see my mouth moving, but no words coming out, say something. But really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Jamie, really appreciate the introduction. Pam and all of NASCA, again, thank you as well. So we're going to be talking about diversity through your talent life cycle. And I think the panel before us and ACE's great keynote talked a lot about the importance of diversity and a diverse workforce and diverse teams, right? Produce better results. They help you track top talent. You have higher engagement, better retention, and then the impact on your communities are far more impactful, I guess, when you have a demographic of your workforce that matches the demographic of your populace. But we know that still remains a problem in today's workplace, especially in state and local government. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We may not solve it today. This is a pretty meaty topic. We have lots to cover, but we'll be brief as quick as we can. And obviously available to talk afterwards for anybody that has more questions. And with that, Cecily, I'll hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about what we're going to get into today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm going to bounce in and out of some screen share here for you.
Awesome. Yep. So as most of you know, LinkedIn's the world's largest professional network. And the reason why I wanted to start and lead with that is when you think about the way that people are finding jobs today, if you can go to the next slide, Jay, basically 70% of jobs are actually filled through networking. So when you think about the power that LinkedIn has to help solve this diversity and this equity problem, a lot of people are coming to LinkedIn today, and we are able to assist government organizations that are trying to hire that talent. One of the things that we've been doing a lot of research on is where does this equity gap come from and what does that look like today? And so our CEO actually coined the term the network gap during our last Talent Connect. And what we'd found is that people from underrepresented groups are actually disproportionately impacted by having smaller networks. So if you could pull up the next slide, Jay. And what we found was that if you grew up in a high income neighborhood, you're actually 3 times more likely to have a stronger network. You're 2 times more likely to have a strong network if you're attending a top school, and you're 2 times more likely to have a strong network if you're working in a top company. So what that means today for when you guys are thinking about diversity and our talent attraction strategies, a lot of times what we're seeing is people are in a very narrow network mindset. And what we've been really focused on is how are we bringing everybody on board onto our network so that we're able to expand that equity across the board. Harvard Business Review actually recently did an article about the impact that COVID-19 has had on unemployment and how that varied across income groups. So one of the things that we saw was people from higher income jobs and things like that were more likely to widen their network during a time of crisis, whereas people from lower income communities tended to winnow their network. So they would be they would have a more insular focus and be turning to immediate friends and family. The problem with this is if we're not having strategies in place to be able to proactively tap the talent that's winnowing, that is already a more disadvantaged group, there's no way to achieve that equity that we talked about earlier.
And I am going to take back over here, and I'm going to share a slide. Ace, I promise I did not we did not talk about this, but when you look at some of the problems that are represented in state government, state government has been historically extremely focused on equality in the past, right? Fair labor laws, fair housing, all this stuff is fair, fair, fair. But when you give everybody the same size box, Ace, as you were referring to, otherwise, let's just say that people's height is representative of their network, right? Those with the strongest network are going to have the best view, the most opportunity. But as Cecily pointed out, there's a massive network gap out there. If 70% of people are finding a job because they knew somebody or they were part of the in crowd or the old boys club or whatever the case may be, right? You've got 30% of the population. They're extremely talented, loaded with skills, but they just don't have the opportunity. So we believe, I love the fact that DEI isn't diversity equality, it's diversity equity, right? Because that really that helps us frame this and understand that there are ways you have to do something different. You have to give other people just as good of a shot. So we talked about a lot with government over the past several years. We've been doing this now for quite some time. And there are resounding themes that come up time and time again when it comes to obstacles for diversity in state and local government. We mentioned referrals. I'll say it again. Referrals have been oftentimes one of the common deterrents to expanding diversity within state government workforce, because people tend to know, people they know that look, talk, walk like them and things of that nature. And there's also a big tendency for intergovernmental movement, like agency to agency, department to department, even city to county, county to state, and then higher education. So there's a lot of movement of this light crowd already taking place. And then lastly, or not lastly, but in addition, there's serial appliers that come from the same talent pool. So if you're fishing in a pond that is only filled with bass, it is impossible to catch a trout. There is no chance, right? So you need to be looking in different talent pools, exploring different opportunities, turning over different rocks to find the different talent that's out there. This is extremely valuable, and again, full of all the skill sets that we're looking for today's modern workforce. And then lastly, another big inhibitor is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into a little bit about what the FBI did, but state government's processes oftentimes are of a disadvantage to those in different demographics. So making sure that your processes are both more modern and current and open to all different demographics when it comes to recruitment.
Awesome. So one of the things that we've seen across the board is that lack of expansion of your network and getting your name out there as an employer of choice and letting people know that you are looking and seeking out diverse talent. As we mentioned, more disadvantaged communities are going to be less likely to be finding you because they're more likely to have an insular network. So it's really important that you're doing what you can to get out and actually tap those people so that they feel at home, so that there's clear expectations of what your hiring process is going to look like. So you're getting out front and center. So what I pulled together was a list of examples of company updates that are on LinkedIn. You could also probably pull this for Facebook or any of the other social networks that are out there. But these are ways that companies are really focusing on how are we bringing diversity and inclusion to life and really telling our story and getting our corporate culture out there. And this is something that with the governments that we've been working with, this has been the top thing that has impacted the results that they're having and the way that they're attracting talent is how are you getting that story out there? Because people don't necessarily know the great work that government's doing or some of the diversity and inclusion programs that you have. So we can send this over afterwards as just some of the examples, but there's things like videos talking about employee resource groups or talking about why you're proud of the veterans that you've hired, doing things like employee spotlights or employee testimonials, or featuring programs that are helping disadvantaged people that are coming into state service be able to elevate their career trajectory over time. And then when we look at how are you engaging and how are we building these communities for diverse individuals on LinkedIn, just to give you a sense of the total reach that's out there, we have about 75% of the US workforce on our platform. And then when we look at how those diversity groups are actually filtering together, you can see you're able to reach things like bilingual individuals, women that are on there, military veterans, and also getting engaged in things like diversity groups. And also looking at where people attended school. So if there's historically Black colleges. So as you think about LinkedIn or anywhere else that you're outreaching, think about how those diverse members are engaging and where you can be proactively reaching out to them so that you can be getting your story out at scale as a government.
Awesome. And I think we're doing okay on time. Cecily, do we want to try and fire up the first Slido question that we had out there? Is the NASCA group ready for that? If not, we can keep going.
Yeah, no, it is.
All right, we'll keep.
And so, yeah, if you've got a bit as we get that Slido running, you can go ahead, Jay.
All right, so we're going to go to Slido, same entrance, NASCA, or the hashtag NASCA20. And what is the top obstacle you encounter when you're trying to hire for diverse talent? Not everybody at once. Well, why don't we, while we get an active poll going, all right, here we go. We got some contributors, here we go. Hiring managers, resources, both not uncommon. Government recruitment limitations, yep. We can talk about a little bit of that here in just a moment with the FBI's example. Availability, all right. Now I can't read them all, but obviously there are obstacles, right? We're not saying that this is easy, but resources seems to be the winning word cloud. Awesome. Well, thank you for that participation. We'll go back to the video only. So what I wanted to tell you a little bit was an example that the FBI did. And now, granted, you may not be thinking you all are the FBI, right? But this example could be used for anybody. Peter Searcy is one of the directors in human resources for the FBI. They went under, I think it was a 3-year journey in transforming how they went about attracting a different population of people for their special agent role. They have to hire thousands of special agents a year, and they were typically straight white men. So what they were trying to do is figure out where in the process was this broken that they needed to fix and review to try and improve this, or trying to fix this problem. So what they did is they literally started at the beginning. They realized they had no data to make directions off of. They had no plan to improve because they felt like they were getting the right number of applicants, when in fact, it was the same applicant, hypothetically on reoccurring. They had old attitudes, so there was a lack of willingness to change, especially at the senior leadership ranks, and had very old processes. Their application process for a special agent was arduous. They put it up on the screen at Talent Connect. Actually, at the end in a follow-up, we'll send you there's a YouTube video of his presentation at LinkedIn Talent Connect back in 2019. But the application process was arduous, multifaceted, but not terribly uncommon from state government. What they found is they had 40,000 people that started the application and didn't finish it. 40,000, that's a huge number of people, right? Even if you're trying to hire for thousands, 40,000 is a monster number. So what they found out is that they took their application process and they broke it up into 3 phases. They found that women and people of color decided that, or not decided, but they, for whatever reason, felt that that application may not be geared for them, and they were dropping out faster than white men. And they went out to their hiring managers and they found out what is the minimum amount of information that we need to get somebody into the system. And that's phase 1, that's it. They take the bare bones, like education, simple name, address, phone number, stuff like that. And if they meet minimum qualifications, they got reached out to by a recruiter, encouraged to then continue on with the process with some warm touch points along the way. 3 years, and they did a lot of other things, so we can't cover it all right now. But 3 years later, their number of female applicants went from the middle teens up to 35%, and they're confident they can get to 45% in the coming years, with 60 being their end goal. So they're trying to go from middle teens of female applicants for the special agent role up to 60%, just by looking at the process, breaking it down, taking corrective measure, and looking at the data. So if you're thinking this isn't something that you can do, you absolutely can. And there's a lot of use cases that we can provide to you to help you understand some different ways to go about that.
Awesome. Can we go ahead and pull up the second Slido poll now? And we're going to ask a similar question to the first one, but before we switch gears and go into obstacles for retention of diverse talent, we wanted to get a chance to hear from you guys on what some of your top obstacles are as from a retention perspective as you guys are thinking about diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. So we've got pay, sponsorship, compensation. So a lot of things around compensation and pay.
We hear and see role models a lot, especially the leadership ranks.
For sure. Also the organizational culture, making sure that you understand that. Intentional inclusion I love as well. Culture's getting larger there. Awesome. Well, this gives a sense of what some of those obstacles that you guys are encountering are. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, data is so critically important in any sort of diversity and inclusion strategy. And so we wanted to talk about a little bit about the importance of running employee surveys. A lot of people when I talk to government agencies, they'll say, oh, we run an employee survey and we do it every 3 years or something like that. And that's not really enough time to give you real-time data. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight was your employees can give you a lot of information. We recently acquired a company called Glint, and I was completely blown away when I saw what surveys in general can do these days. So when you're thinking about like, why is attrition happening on a particular team, or why aren't women ascending into leadership positions, or why are our diverse employees leaving our organization? It's really crazy the amount of data that you can get to today by running regular employee surveys. So to give a little bit of perspective, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that LinkedIn did, because we had our own diversity problems a couple of years ago, and we've really had a huge turnaround in the number of diverse people that are coming into our workforce, and also the retention rates of those individuals. So one of the things that we started to do was more frequent surveying of our employees so that we could have a more frequent pulse check. So it's actually gotten to the point, we started out doing this quarterly, but we now get actually monthly employee surveys that give information to managers about how their teams are feeling, things along those lines. So as you're thinking about the importance of data, it's critically important that you're actually getting some of that data directly from your employee base, and that you have a pulse check and a way to understand exactly what they're thinking and feeling in the moment. The other thing that LinkedIn did that we've really transitioned over to is we've invested a lot in our employee resource groups and doing support of that. So every single one of our employee resource groups actually has an executive sponsor that's in a senior leadership position, and they actually work very closely hand in hand to make sure that we're bringing the culture of these various groups. So we have, I think, around 20 employee resource groups. So that ranges from Enable In, which is for disabled individuals who are working at LinkedIn. We have a veterans employee resource group. We have a Black inclusion group. Really, it's just up to what we've encouraged is all of our employees to feel empowered to start a group if they had some sort of identity that they were trying to bring life to. And what that's actually done is really change the way that our culture works across the board by celebrating a lot of these employee resource groups and being able to see the impact that these various groups are having we're better able to understand the culture. And it started a lot of these conversations that are so important to have between employees, and building that cultural understanding or understanding of some of the obstacles that people are going through if they have a disability or something like that. So it's really opened up the importance of having those conversations internally and creating a culture where you're not shying away from those kinds of conversations, and you're able to celebrate the differences that are within your workforce. So when it came to a retention perspective, those were two of the areas that we really wanted to highlight that have had the biggest impact on our organization.
Yeah, and I would also add that those ERG groups, they're led by oftentimes individual contributors or less senior employees, and it's a great leadership development pipeline for people of different backgrounds to gain exposure, network, and then take a more leadership role in time within your organization. So can't echo the importance of ERGs enough.
Jay, do you have a sense of what the response rates are for the employee pulse surveys? I figured as a manager, you might have a better sense. That was a question that came through the feed.
No, but they've improved over time. I think they were fairly low early on when LinkedIn started doing them, but I know now they're up over 85, 90%. So they're pretty high now. Managers, I mean, it's a very, very big part of our culture. Managers only get scores if enough people take them. Otherwise, managers don't get any feedback or information. And then there's not scrutiny there, but there's a lot of like, inspect what we expect type efforts there. And there's no necessary stick that comes with it. We try to use more of a carrot on those.
I think that the other thing that really bolstered the response rates is it used to be really long. As someone that had to fill those out all the time, it was terrible. But we actually got it down to like now there's only 10 questions, and it's a lot of like rankings that are still able to push that forward. So I would say that as you're also thinking about your surveying, figuring out what the minimum amount of information that's going to give you the information that you need. And there's plenty of firms, whether that's, I think Deloitte mentioned that they were doing some things in this area. There's Glint, there's SurveyMonkey, there's tons of resources that are out there that are working in this space. But figuring out like, how can you do this in the most efficient process possible so that your employees aren't feeling overwhelmed by it.
And we are coming up on time, so appreciate the questions. If there are further questions, Cecily and I can make ourselves available through normal channels, email, phone calls, etc. Looking forward to speaking with everybody. One other thing that we did want to just close with in wrapping, I think Cara from Colorado and some others mentioned learning and development, not only their frontline employees, but their leaders when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and belonging, and DIBS as we call it. There's a LinkedIn Learning course that if you're not a LinkedIn Learning customer, you can still have access to. We've made it free for everybody through the rest of the year. It's like a 5-hour, 7-course training path that you can give to your entire organization or to your entire leadership group. We'll follow that up with everybody as a takeaway if you want to encourage people to take those online courses. There's a tremendous amount of information out there, from unconscious bias all the way down. So hopefully this information was useful for everybody. It's definitely not something, fixing a diversity inclusion, I wouldn't just call it a problem, but trying to improve the numbers when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't an overnight process. It's a multi-year journey. And I think for those that are underway, kudos to you, and those that are looking to get started. No time like the present. And if there's something we can do to help, we'd be happy to. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Pam. And thanks, Ace.
Of course, Jay, Cecily, much appreciated. A really informative session. Kwesi, I want to thank you as well for the session before. And as we run into breakouts, which we'll be doing here very shortly, I want to thank the panelists that we had on as well. Cara, Janelle, Michelle, Jason, Leslie. So we've got a whole group of people we've just heard from. They've shared ideas, thoughts, content, all of which has been incredible. And now we want to turn it over. Part of the beauty of NASCA and being a part of this organization is to have those smaller, more intimate conversations. So we've got 2 prompts as you head into breakout rooms, and you will be whooshed away into the ether here very shortly. 2 prompts, the first of which is concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion. What specific trainings have you done, and to what audience? The second one is, how are you embedding DEI into your daily activities? So between those 2 prompts, those are what you'll work on in your 10-minute breakouts. We're going to kick you out of the main room and into breakouts here in a second. There we go. Welcome back, everyone. As you're filtering back into the main room, hopefully you had a fruitful breakout session with your moderators. And, in thinking about the prompts, what training have you done? And how do you embed DEI into your daily activities? I think two really important questions. And hopefully you had some sharing of best practices and interesting things that have been done in your agencies and organizations. And so there were a couple threads as I kind of jumped between rooms, your standard bias training, starting to unpack unconscious bias or mitigate bias. There's, I heard a lot about surveying, just getting a baseline for how and where you're measuring diversity. And then there were a couple pieces of training and hiring practices. So getting the right people in the room, filling the pipeline. I hear a lot that there are pipeline issues, and quite frankly, we're not looking hard enough if that's the case. So I heard a couple people allude to that, and ultimately, once we fill that pipeline, how do we make sure the right people who fit our culture and as our culture shifts, we make sure that's representative. So caught a really good crop of threads. And then the trust piece popped up a bit as well, trust building exercises and sessions in order to get to a place where you can have candid, open, honest dialogues about how we're maybe missing the mark and how we're moving forward. So just had some incredible conversations in breakout rooms. And I just saw a note that Herman Bowles and Dan Wolf both won today's Twitter contest. So congratulations to both of you. I see Pam laughing, and I'm gonna point you to Pam to go collect on whatever you have won via that Twitter competition. Herman shrugging, he's not sure how he won, but won indeed. Oh, look at that. We've got a large bottle of hand sanitizer coming your way. Large office, Herman, large bottle of hand sanitizer. I like it. So as we wrap up for the day, I want to bring Cara back really briefly and acknowledge that Cara was a big piece of spearheading a lot of the conversation that we had today. So Cara, I'm gonna put you on the spot ever so slightly and ask big takeaways from today. Maybe a thing or two that you heard that you liked and that we all ought to take to heart. What are your thoughts there?
Sure, it was so much. It was like the executive summary of a semester-long course that we should all be so fortunate to take. So thank you for your expertise and the vendors for presenting what they're doing around EDI. I think was really helpful as well. Starting at the basics for terms, because oftentimes we get hung up on the terms was helpful. I think a zero-sum game, it is not a zero-sum game. Keeping that in mind is so pivotal. Janelle raised these are difficult conversations. Like if you were not having difficult conversation in this area, you were doing it wrong, right? Your team does not trust you. So really being vulnerable in this space, telling them you're not sure how to do this, I think is really important. I think all the information on data, like all government is moving to database decision-making. And so even if we're just starting with the baseline of let's do an engagement survey to understand, let's break apart our hiring process so we can understand the kinds of employees we're attracting was so important. So many great things. I could go on and on, but I won't.
Cara, thank you for that. No, I all of those pieces that you just pulled out, particularly as I mentioned, the trust piece resonated as well. So I appreciate everyone's candor in our conversations, the panel, and then of course, LinkedIn and Deloitte as vendors sharing their expertise with all of us. And lastly, I'd like to thank both NASCA for convening all of us to have this conversation and all of you for joining in and engaging. So with that, that should wrap us up for the day. The last thing I'll leave you with is Thursday's session kicking off at 3 p.m. Citizen-centric processes and digitization. And we've got a panel discussion on thought leadership reactions to emerging technologies. So particularly for being in a virtual environment. And then as we think about data collection, shifting DEI, and all of the other pieces of running state organizations, we'll have a really awesome conversation with Chris Liu from Washington, Michael Newsom from Pennsylvania, Josh Jabel from Connecticut, on how they can think about technology a little bit better in our agencies. So tune in for Thursday, kicking off at 3 p.m. And on behalf of NASCA from the Richmond office, thank you for joining. We're looking forward to seeing you later in the week.